Think Env. June 6, 1945. A sandpit near Braunschweig, Germany. American military police lead a 16-year-old boy to a wooden stake. His name is Heinz Petri. He is thin. His civilian jacket hangs loose on his shoulders. In the United States, a boy his age is just earning a driver's license. Here, he is a condemned spy. The MPs are massive. Their polished white helmets and heavy boots dwarf the prisoner. They pull Petri's arms behind his back. The rope bites into his wrists. A white cloth is tied over his eyes. The fabric is too large for his face. It slips, covering his nose and mouth. Yards away, 17-year-old Joseph Schoner watches. He is next. This was the clash of two worlds. On one side, the American military bureaucracy. On the other, the Nazi total war doctrine that turned children into disposable intelligence assets. The Americans followed the protocol for espionage. Petri and Schoner were not the only ones. They were the visible end of a massive state-sponsored machine. A machine that spent 12 years turning toddlers into fanatics. The firing squad forms a line. Rifles are raised. The bolt of a Garand clicks. The air smells of damp sand and gun oil. The squad leader raises his hand. Total silence. The trigger pull was just the final step. 12 years before Heinz Petri stood before a firing squad, the conveyor belt began to move. The NSDAP did not see children as pupils. They saw them as a raw strategic resource. The party treated the young mind like soft clay. It was a calculated investment in biological material. Adults ask questions. Children obey. To build a nation of fanatics, you start before the subject learns to think. How do you turn a schoolboy into a soldier? You seize him before he understands the word no. In early 1933, the Hitler Youth was a marginal group. It held 50,000 members. These were mostly sons of the party elite. By the end of that same year, the number exploded to 2 million. By 1936, the choice for a German boy had vanished. The state liquidated every alternative. It was a cold, calculated monopoly on the soul. The regime viewed competing loyalties as a threat. They outlawed the Boy Scouts. They disbanded church youth groups. They arrested members of communist clubs. One law made it official. Only one organization could exist. From ages 10 to 18, you were either in or you were an outcast. The party didn't just recruit, it cleared the field. Look at the surface. You see campfires, hiking boots, and forest expeditions. You hear folk songs under the stars. That was the bait. But the reality looked different. Inside the camps, the sound of scouts singing died out. It was replaced by the metallic rattle of rifle bolts. 13-year-olds stopped building bridges. They began practicing with grenades. The transition was seamless. One day you are a boy in a uniform. The next, you are a cog in a military machine. The state didn't want scouts. It wanted soldiers. The training shifted from nature to ballistics. Every boy learned the weight of steel. He adjusted his grip, stepped forward, and practiced the throw. The uniform felt sharp. The steel felt real. For a 10-year-old boy, the Hitler Youth was not a classroom. It was an adventure. They handled Mauser rifles. They threw practice grenades. They studied military tactics on sand tables. Every gesture suggested a game. Behind the polished buttons lay a program of self-destruction. This was not pedagogy. It was the industrial engineering of loyalty. A schoolteacher stands at the chalkboard. He writes a complex formula. Beside it, he scrawls a slogan. Germany must live, even if we must die. The children solve for the trajectory of a bomber. They calculate the cost of feeding subhumans versus soldiers. Hatred was taught as a precise science. It was as cold as mathematics. Franz Jägermann remembered the pressure. He was a member of the Hitler Youth. He later described the process not as education, but as a physical strike. The ideology was hammered into them. Imagine a nail driven into a block of wood. The first strike breaks the surface. The second sinks deep. By the 10th, the metal is part of the grain. You cannot pull it out without destroying the wood itself. Repetition was the hammer. They sang songs of blood and soil until the lyrics replaced their own thoughts. They chanted the same slogans 10,000 times. There was no alternative truth. There was only the Führer. The transition from party reserve to military resource was nearly complete. In 1937, General Erwin Rommel arrived to inspect the quality of this human material. Wehrmacht generals began appearing at children's rallies. In 1937, Erwin Rommel did not see children. He saw raw ballistic potential. The Desert Fox spent months touring Hitler youth rallies. He lectured 10-year-olds on the mechanics of soldiering. He pressured the organization's leadership with a single goal: transform a political club into a junior army. Why teach a 10-year-old to pull a trigger? To ensure the Reich had a ready reserve of fanatics 5 years later. The results were mathematical. A dedicated rifle school opened its doors. By 1938, 1.5 million boys had completed marksmanship training. This force was larger than the entire British Army of the same period. Before the year ended, 51,000 children wore sniper badges on their sleeves. They learned to kill with military precision. They practiced before the first shot of the war was fired. The state was forging a weapon out of flesh and bone. September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. World War II began. The transformation shifted into high gear. The Hitler Youth ceased to be a propaganda tool. It became a functional branch of the Wehrmacht. At first, the boys handled the periphery of slaughter. They ran messages through ruins. They manned civil defense posts during air raids. They assisted with evacuations. But the front line was hungry. As German casualties mounted, the state shifted these children from auxiliary roles to the line of fire. The disaster at Stalingrad changed everything. 300,000 German soldiers were dead or captured. The Sixth Army had ceased to exist. On the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht faced a void that adult recruits could no longer fill. The state turned to its last reserve. Since 1942, the regime had operated WE camps, specialized defense strengthening facilities. These were not summer retreats for wilderness survival. 16-year-old boys practiced with MG-34 machine guns. They threw live stick grenades. They stripped and assembled Lugers until the motion was mechanical. The transition from student to soldier followed a brutal logic. As the front lines collapsed, the Hitler Youth ceased to be a paramilitary club. It became a biological resource for a dying empire. The government looked at children and saw infantry. The decision was finalized. In June 1943, the Reich synthesized its most lethal experiment. It was a division built from human scrap and stolen childhood. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. 20,000 soldiers, an entire armored fist. Almost every private and corporal shared a single birth year, 1926. Who operated these steel giants? Boys. Most were 16 or 17 years old when the unit formed. The structure was a biological anomaly. Veteran officers from the Eastern Front stood like monoliths over the ranks. These men were killers. The children were their clay. The uniforms told the story. Tunics hung loose on narrow adolescent shoulders. Sleeves were rolled up to reveal thin wrists. In the 1st Battalion, 65% of the personnel were minors. Only 3% had reached the age of 25. The state didn't give them toys. It gave them Panzer IVs and Panthers. It gave them MG-42s, stick grenades, and anti-tank launchers. Indoctrination replaced instinct. They didn't fear death because they were taught that dying for the Führer was the only way to live. This wasn't a military unit. It was a cult with heavy artillery. Soldier logs showed the same entry over and over. Born, 1926. In the summer of 1944, the trains began moving toward the front. To the Allied veterans, they looked like children. Smooth faces, oversized helmets, high-pitched voices. But in the summer of 1944, these wolves met the Canadian Army in Normandy, and the illusion of childhood vanished. The date, June 7, 1944. One day after the landings, the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, arrives at the front. Their mission is simple: push the Allies back into the sea. Near the village of Authie, they encounter the North Nova Scotia Highlanders. The teenagers do not fight like soldiers, they fight like fanatics. Canadian tank commanders watch in horror. Boys sprint through machine gun fire. They jump onto moving hulls. They wedge grenades into tank treads. No cover, no hesitation, no survival instinct. 28. That is the number of Canadian tanks destroyed by these children during the Normandy campaign. It was an engineering feat of indoctrination. The state had successfully deleted the fear of death from their minds. At Offie, the North Nova Scotia Highlanders eventually ran out of ammunition. Surrounded and exhausted, they raised their hands. They followed the rules of war. They expected the safety of a prisoner of war camp. Instead, the young soldiers of the Hitlerjugend began to murder the captives on the spot. In the gardens of Ardennes Abbey, heroism died. The investigation into the 12th SS Panzer Division reveals a systematic collapse of military law. At the Abbey headquarters, teenagers in camouflage led prisoners into the shadows, one by one. 20 Canadian soldiers were executed in the garden. How did children become executioners? They were taught that mercy is a defect. The mechanism was simple. Kurt Meyer, the division commander, gave the nod. He told his troops to retaliate for the bombing of German cities. He encouraged them to stop taking prisoners. The teenagers obeyed. They didn't just shoot, they clubbed captives to death. They used bayonets. At one point, a truck steered directly into a line of bound men. Near a column of Panzer IVs, a tank commander drove over the bodies of the fallen. The scale was no longer a series of accidents. 156. That is the number of Canadian prisoners murdered by this single division. The pattern repeated at Château d'Audrieu. The reconnaissance battalion commander questioned 3 Canadians. They stayed silent. He ordered their immediate execution. Minutes later, 6 more died. Then, a machine gun finished the rest near the chateau walls. 19 murders in one location. The sensorics of the crime were consistent. The smell of diesel from idling tanks. The sharp crack of a Luger in a quiet monastery garden. These weren't rogue acts. Officers demanded blood, and 18-year-olds delivered it. The state had successfully erased the line between a soldier and a butcher. To these boys, cruelty was a duty. After the Ardennes Abbey murders, the moral landscape dissolved. Allied investigators faced a legal void. Every boy in the dock claimed the same defense. They were raised to kill. The judicial machine ground to a halt. How do you punish a 17-year-old for a massacre he committed at 15? Indoctrination had begun at age 10. Teachers, officers, and parents had spent years framing mercy as a lethal defect. The system struggled to find a precedent. In late 1944, a military court convicted 2 15-year-old boys for the execution of a prisoner of war. They received prison sentences, but thousands of others simply walked away. Most child soldiers who pulled triggers never saw a courtroom. Proving individual guilt became impossible. The law could not separate a child's will from the state's mandate. Most of these adolescent killers returned to their families as if nothing had happened. The legal system did not know how to handle a generation of war criminals in short pants. But the era of legal ambiguity was ending. In the final months of 1944, the front lines began to evaporate. The Allies were tearing through France while the Soviets dismantled the East. The Third Reich needed eyes behind enemy lines. Justice shifted from the courtroom to the firing squad. The Nazi leadership stopped sending children into battle and started sending them into the shadows. The state stopped training soldiers and began deploying spies. A frightened teenager tied to a wooden stake, a secret report labeling him a lethal spy. The archive photo from June 6, 1945, defies the laws of war and childhood. Heinz Petri was 16 years old. He was born on December 31, 1928. He had celebrated his 16th birthday only a few months before facing the rifles. Beside him stood 17-year-old Joseph Schoner. Both were former Hitler Youth members. Both were caught hiding in a foxhole behind American lines near Braunschweig. The military court at Mönchengladbach was brief. The charge? Espionage. The verdict? Death. American MPs led them to the sandpit. They wore oversized civilian jackets and worn-out trousers. This detail sealed their fate. Under the rules of war, a soldier without a uniform is a spy. A spy has no rights. Petri looked small against the post. In the United States at that time, a 16-year-old was too young to hold a full driver's license. Here, he was old enough to be executed by a superpower. The GIs moved with mechanical precision. They checked the ropes. They stepped back into formation. Petri stared at the firing squad. He heard the sharp, dry commands in English. He didn't understand the words. He only understood the metallic click of the Garand bolts. The officer raised his hand. The soldiers took aim. The squad fired a synchronized volley. The echoes of the volley faded. Dust kicked up from the impact, swirling around the base of the wooden post. Heinz Petri's body slumped forward against the ropes. It was June the 14th, 1945. Braunschweig. The American squad stood in formation. Their rifles were still warm. They did not move. 4 minutes of silence followed while the dust settled. Then, an officer stepped forward. He checked the boy's pulse. Was Petri a spy or a lost child? The military tribunals did not waste time with the distinction. They were fast. They were brutal. Defense was minimal. Evidence was often circumstantial. But the sentence was always the same. The soldiers untied the body. They hauled it away to make room. Then, they brought out 17-year-old Joseph Schoner for his turn. This was not an isolated act of vengeance. It was a mechanical process. On the same day, near Rheinberg, American forces executed 6 more German prisoners. The charge was always espionage. Among the dead were SS personnel captured in civilian clothes. Similar executions continued across the occupied zones throughout the summer of 1945. The legal system faced a paradox. A high-ranking SS general who ordered massacres received a team of lawyers. A hungry teenager hiding in a hole received a firing squad. Compare the scenery. Heinz Petri stands in a muddy pit. He is 16. His face is gaunt. The air smells of damp earth and cordite. Now look at the courtroom in Aurich. Kurt Meyer, commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division, sits in a clean uniform. He has a defense counsel. He has the right to speak. Was this justice or merely revenge? The gavel strikes the wood in a silent room. In the woods of Braunschweig, a rifle volley cracks through the trees. The 12th SS had murdered 40 Canadian prisoners of war in cold blood. Meyer was responsible. In December 1945, a court sentenced him to death. But the system blinked. By 1946, his sentence was commuted to life. Officers received prison terms. Child soldiers received graves. The Geneva Convention set the age of combat at 15. Petri was 16. Under the letter of the law, he was a combatant. Because he wore no uniform, the Americans classified him as a spy. They followed the rules. But the rules ignored the indoctrination. These boys were shaped into weapons by the state. They were victims of systematic abuse on a national scale, executed for following the orders of the adults who broke them. The disparity is a cold mathematical fact. Meyer walked out of prison in 1954. He was a free man. By that time, Heinz Petri had been rotting in the ground for 9 years. Go back to late 1944. The Reich was collapsing. Berlin needed a shadow army. They called it Werwolf. Why were children in civilian clothes considered more dangerous than the Wehrmacht? To the Allies, they were ghosts with grenades. Guerrilla units focused on sabotage, assassination, and intelligence gathering. They operated behind the front lines. The strategy was simple. A teenager in a dirty jacket looks like a victim. He is just a child caught in the wrong place. But underneath the jacket, he carried a Walther or a wire. It was the perfect cover. Judges did not look at age. They looked at a single instruction manual titled Werwolf. According to the laws of war, a combatant without a uniform is a spy. Spies do not get prisoner of war status. They do not get protection from the Geneva Convention. The technicality was lethal. A soldier in a tunic goes to a camp. A boy in a sweater goes to a wall. Military law stripped the child of his humanity and turned him into a legitimate target. The firing squad was the only legal conclusion. But the werewolf was only the tip of the iceberg. By October 1944, the front lines no longer needed spies. They needed meat. The Reich was empty. 20 million adult men had already been consumed by the war. The reserve was gone. To fill the gap, the Nazi leadership turned on its own families. They created the Volkssturm, the People's Army. How do you replace a lost generation? You draft the next one. The law said 16 to 60. The reality said 10. Children were pulled from classrooms and handed K98K rifles. In some units, 10-year-olds trained with Panzerfaust anti-tank launchers. These weapons were designed for men. Some boys were so small they had to be lifted by adults just to reach the trigger mechanism. The training was a death sentence, half a day of instruction, sometimes less. 15-year-old Heinz Schutz from Leipzig received a few hours of drill and an oversized SS uniform. There was no time for graduation or goodbyes. Officers packed the children into trucks and sent them directly to the front. Heinz Schutz received a uniform that was too large and the command that was too heavy. The sleeves of the SS jacket swallowed his hands. He had to roll the wool back several times just to grip a rifle. The steel helmet didn't sit. It slid down, covering his eyes. Did they know they were marching to their deaths? The state promised them eternal glory. In reality, commanders knew these boys were only buying time. Every child sacrificed was a line in a ledger, intended to stall the Allied advance by a few hours or minutes. By early 1945, the classroom had become the recruitment center. Teachers traded pens for Panzerfausts. 10-year-olds stood in formation, drowning in oversized gear. The heavy anti-tank launchers weighed nearly 10 kilograms. For a malnourished teenager, the weapon was a physical burden as much as a tactical one. The system demanded suicide missions. The boys were told Germany needed heroes. They weren't told the war was already lost. The leadership simply used children as human sandbags against the inevitable. Desertion was not an option. If a boy dropped his weapon to run home to his mother, the SS was waiting. Internal terror became the final law of the Reich. In April 1945, squads executed Hitler Youth members for the crime of wanting to live. Heinz Schutz witnessed the price of hesitation. He saw his peers shot by their own side for trying to return to their families. By April 1945, the enemy was no longer the only threat. For the youth of Berlin, the most dangerous uniform was the one worn by their own countrymen. Margaret Fisher, a local ticket seller, watched the city dissolve into a furnace of burning trucks and jagged barricades. She stood in the chaos as the SS dragged a boy into the street. He looked 14, perhaps younger. His crime was desertion. The boy refused to die for a ghost empire, so his neighbors killed him instead. Contrast: a child executed by his own people for the simple desire to breathe. It was a mathematical trap. Fight and probably die. Run and definitely die. Fisher saw the result of this internal terror. Thousands of soldiers were already discarding their insignias, desperate to reach the Western Allies before the Soviets closed the iron ring around the capital. Amidst this disintegration, groups of Hitler Youth were left behind. Some were lost during the retreat. Others were waiting in the shadows with specific orders. The Nazi leadership had already prepared for the collapse of the front lines. Starting in late 1944, they organized a third option. The execution of Heinz Petri was a localized tragedy. In Berlin, this scenario repeated 1,000 times. Justice for war crimes followed a cynical hierarchy. High-ranking officers who ordered massacres faced trials, lawyers, and eventual sentence reductions. Child soldiers suspected of spying faced a brick wall and a firing squad. Who actually defended the capital of the Reich? The numbers reveal a suicide mission. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers squeezed the city. They brought 6,500 tanks and over 8,000 aircraft. Against them stood 45,000 defenders. Most were fragments of broken divisions. 2.5 million against 45,000. The math was terminal. General Helmuth Weidling looked at his maps and saw a ghost army. He had fewer than 15,000 trained soldiers left. The rest were the Volkssturm and the Hitler Youth. Boys aged 14 and younger stood in the rubble with Panzerfausts they could barely carry. 1,252. That is the official count of Hitler Youth and labor service boys Weidling found in his final review. 1,200 children. enough to fill 2 full combat battalions, yet they lacked even basic infantry training. Weitling had precisely 1,252,